Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Christensen. Welcome to Scare-A-Thon 2023, benefiting the Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the docuseries Queer for Fear, the history of queer horror. And here to chat with me about said series are my friends Robin Graves and Anna Maria. Wait, I had fancy banners. There they are. There we go. And we are talking about Queer for Fear from 2022, subtitled The History of Queer Horror. I'm so glad you all are coming on the show tonight. Thank you for stopping by, not only to benefit this very worthy organization, but also to chat about this very worthy documentary series. I'm so glad I saw this, and I'm so glad we get to chat about it.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on, us on. I'll speak for you. That's fine, right? No, but thanks for inviting us to come on. Yeah, super excited about this one. I thought it was a really cool little doc.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it too. It hit a lot of points that I hate to say I was kind of looking for ahead of time.
Sure.
But yeah, I was really pleased with the overall output on it.
Well, one of the things I like to say is that I watch horror movies so that I can talk to other people about horror movies. And what I really enjoyed about this as a kind of a straight white male was my lens is going to be so different. And it was so great watching this and going, oh shit, like the movie I'm watching is not the movie you're watching. And I'm so like jazzed at hearing these different interpretations and how people identified things like that. I'm so glad that Shudder put this out. Robin, you'd seen this before we talked about scheduling this for the show, right?
Yeah, I watched it as soon as it came out. You say queer and horror, and I'm first in line. Like I'm gonna be there. You dropped your like straight white man. I'm like a far from straight sort of man. So like it's I don't know. Yeah, you say queer history of horror, and I'm so down. And then it's directed by Bryan Fuller,
Right.
who did like NBC's Hannibal, which is like peak queer TV. Like it's so good. And so yeah, I was like on board immediately, and it didn't disappoint. And it was like weirdly validating, especially in a lot of the like episodes 1 and 2 where they're talking about like the Universal films and I might be putting the cart ahead of the horse a little bit, but where they're talking about like the Universal films and like the pre-code stuff into like Hitchcock and all that. And there's so many of those movies I remember watching when I first was getting into like genre cinema or whatever and being like, this is the gayest thing I've ever seen. And and you try to bring that up to people, like the stuff about Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein and how it's like this man eschewing women to try and make life. And then like this man whose marriage gets interrupted and then he's obsessed with this other man for the rest of his life. And I remember pointing things out like that and like really relating to that in those characters. And my friends that I was checking these movies out being like, you're reaching. What are you talking about? You're just looking for anything. So to hear like film scholars and directors and stuff like that be like, no, this is totally like there. It did my heart a lot of good.
Yeah, it was really validating to hear like back up on that. Like, see, like
I'm not obsessed. It's there. Yeah.
Right? Like it's a real thing. Yeah, that's exactly like those first 2 episodes were fantastic. Not to say that the other 2 episodes weren't, but I think the 2 strongest episodes were, at least for me, the first 2, talking about, like you said, the Universal monster stuff. James Whale, I think we all like know him and love him and respect him as a real creator of the genre that we know, the filmic version of it, right? So like, giving all those props to him and all of the things that he put in as an openly gay man in Hollywood. He wasn't shy about, casting queer actors in his films. And putting in, adding in these themes. He had no hesitation about it. And for that time period, super bold, of him to do so. But I really loved like when they got into Hitchcock. I was like,
yeah,
I
had never thought about Hitchcock through like a queer lens before. And hearing them bring that up, I was like, hey, they make a point to talk about how he has like a sort of unpleasant feeling about sex in a lot of his movies. And that's something I'd never been able to put my finger on. But it's like, so it's the same thing with like a Stephen King novel but in the opposite direction, where like Stephen King's writing about sex is like so lewd. It's like so lascivious and
really
like
gross.
it feels like he thinks of it as like a really dirty thing, but he's like leaned into it. Whereas Hitchcock's sex is like, it seems like he thinks it's a really dirty thing that he wants to keep as far away from as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I think anybody can see, regardless of what approach you're coming from, that Hitchcock has a real problem with women.
What a man in the 60s.
Maybe the understatement of the year, but serious problems with women. And like the way that I mean, knowing from talking with Tippi Hedren at one of the Horror Hound weekends, I mean, she was terrorized by him.
Jeez.
Like absolutely terrorized by him. But when you watch his films and you pick up on these things, I don't know, you kind of wonder, like, is he lashing out because he's misogynist, or because there's something underneath that he is not understanding and able to like properly cope with, due to the time period, due to his upbringing? Is like, it really does kind of make you wonder about that. Like, I think he was working out some pretty serious deep-seated things in his.
My guess is column A and column B.
Yeah,
I think it's a little bit of both of those. Yeah,
can and are probably true. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't give him a pass by any means, but it does kind of give you something a little more to chew on than just, okay, he's just obsessed with blondes.
Okay, He-Man woman hater.
Yeah, right.
But if he was like a gay man out around now, can you imagine what his Grindr messages would be like? I would like you if you would come to my house. Are you hosting this evening?
So the thing is like, so many of these stories are so kind of ingrained. I mean, we've read about them for years and years and years in myriad reference books, and we think we kind of know the story. And what's exciting about this series is hearing it told from a different perspective and identifying things that we hadn't been instructed to pick up on, and things that the queer audiences were like instinctively picking up on. And whether it was the filmmaker's intent or not, it's that when you give art to the audience, it becomes theirs and they get to do with it what they want. I mean, I immediately, while I was watching this, I said, monsters are punished simply for being what they are. Like, they're just monsters. And most time they didn't choose to be monsters. They certainly didn't choose to be monstrous, or at least perceived as monstrous by the public. They're just out there being who they are. And I was like, oh my gosh, hello, metaphor. Like, this really resonates. And I've heard that from many horror fans saying that they felt, like an outsider, or they didn't fit in. That's what attracted them to the horror genre. But it's like, to hear it kind of like as a real outsider, where somebody who's like, we are not accepted. We are not allowed to be seen. And I mean, I'm so glad that here we are in 2023, and then we're able to have a show like this out there for queer kids to find, for straight kids to find. I mean, I feel like that's as important, is that let's have that conversation.
I think it's almost more important. I mean, obviously, we're going to be fans of this kind of programming, right? Like Robin and I are going to be like super into this just on the face value, but I think this is a really important docu-series for everyone to watch. Everyone who considers themselves a fan of horror,
right,
should watch this program, because you have to be able to understand, like you said, not everybody is watching the same movie in the same way. We're all approaching it from different angles, and I think it's a good eye opener for the straight cis crowd in particular.
Yeah, it was cool to me, Aaron, that you brought up like how a lot of these films you'd never seen in that kind of a light before, and that sort of flicked the light switch for me just now, where like there were some things during the doc I was watching it and I was like, okay, that's kind of a given. Like I feel like you're like making content that like you could gloss over this, but because I've just for most of my adult life, I've been watching these films with other queer people. So we all like click to that same thing and sort of vibe on the same frequency there. And if there's somebody who's not queer watching it with us, they're so queer adjacent that they're like, oh my God, I see what you guys are going for here. So to hear somebody like sort of detached from that like scene being like, oh my God, I hadn't considered, like, that makes the whole thing make sense in total there. But and you bring up that point about like where they talked a lot about a lot of queer people like identifying with a monster, and how it's often been a metaphor for that you didn't choose it and everybody lashes out at you for it. But I remember, and partly just from like a personal obsession, but I always likened like, haha, that'll be funny in a second. But I've always likened my like sexual identity as like a mask queer person to like a werewolf. And then to hear that be talked about in the episode about like the howling and all of that, it's like, see, like there are others out here. And like, yeah, it's such a, especially when it's something you're coming to grips with or like just getting used to, like you feel like in the daylight, you're just another guy walking around and nobody knows you've got this horrible beast that comes out under the light of a full moon and video head cleaner. But it's like, it's, yeah, that's for the gays. But, but yeah, it's so that it's like, and then I noticed when I watched today, I had not seen the last episode that was like all about like sapphic connections and like lesbian vampires and how that's like a huge, and it's very funny how like the gay men have the werewolves and the lesbians and other sapphic people have vampires, and then in twain they meet. Yeah, and I just thought that was really cool.
Well, watching that last episode in particular, that was one that kind of took me back to my Terror in the Isles days, watching like the clip shows, the clip movies. And you'd have movies in there, you're like, is that a horror movie? Who thinks that, and there were things like, like putting Bound in. I'm like, obviously Bound is like a really great lesbian film, but is it a horror movie? Does it belong here? Or are you just trying to make a point with it? Any thoughts on that?
So yeah, I'd never even heard of Bound, and so I'll let you go through there. I love Jennifer Tilly, but I'd never heard of that one.
Oh yeah, well, you need to see the Bound then for sure.
Yeah. That was actually like I think my biggest sticking point with this series is it started to veer a little more into like the thriller territory. Sure. And I know that there's a lot of cross-contamination here and it kind of walks a fine line, but I felt like it was like we got a little off track.
Yeah.
And it does fit in. I mean, it does make the point of like the predatory lesbian trope and all of
Right.
that stuff, and that's fine. But I think maybe it veered a little too far into that, and I was hoping it would kind of come back around or
Right.
something, and it sort of just stops. Like in the 90s, time-wise, it kind of is just like that's it.
Right.
So I'm not sure if there's going to be additional episodes coming. I also would have liked, and I know it's not fair to talk about things that aren't in a
Sure.
thing, but it's very American centric. The films
Yeah.
that were covered.
Yeah, you
There's
get the
a
Jean
lot of-
Roland. Yeah, you get the Jean Roland lesbian vampires, and that's kind of the extent of our international flavor.
Yeah,
when they brought up predatory lesbians and didn't talk about High Tension, I thought that was like
Oh wow, yeah,
a little weird.
yeah.
And that's like a straight up and down horror film. Like
For sure, for sure.
You could cut out
Exactly.
what's the one, oh my god, that 90s movie where the homegirl moves in and like starts looking
Single
like,
white female.
Yeah, where she like takes her
Yeah.
hair and clothes.
That was
out.
another one. I'm like, that's not a horror movie. I mean, not really.
Yeah, it's a really solid like thriller for sure. But
Yeah.
like I just saw it thematically, it was a little weird, and I would have just slapped High Tension in there.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
it reminded me. Sorry, Anna, go ahead.
no, yeah, like High Tension, of course. Raw didn't come
Right.
up at all.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let the Right One In,
Right.
the OG one. I mean, there's a lot of movies that are like really queer horror films, and also, and I get that it's got its own entire documentary, but they only showed like one clip from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2.
Right.
That's like the gayest horror movie.
Well, and
Don't get
also
no
like
better either, yeah.
all like the Dave Dakota. I mean, like Dave Dakota was built like a cottage industry making gay horror films. So just kind of like, and the fact that doesn't get mentioned at all. I mean, and obviously, you know, it's a series. It's 4 hours long, so I mean, we're covering a lot of ground. But it is kind of one of those things where it's like, well, you didn't need to shore things up with the thrillers. You know, you have enough material to work with here. The Terror in the Isles episode, like it's like when like Vice Squad and Nighthawks with Sylvester Stallone popped up. I'm like, I don't think so.
I feel like it's terrifying in a different way.
Yeah.
But I definitely, I thought that it was nice to see it cover as much ground and have in such a diverse number of voices to the point where I'm like going, oh shit, I didn't even know she was gay. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Well, and it was crazy to me when they were talking about Bound and how Jennifer Tilly said the like casting directors had trouble casting her part because people didn't want to play lesbian. And like how like it would be detrimental to your career. And that's so crazy. Not only like practically it's crazy now because like how hard did Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger ride off of Brokeback Mountain?
Right.
Like, so practically as like thinking like an actor now, that is such a different landscape. And also like that's the 90s and it was still a big deal to like even pretend to be gay on a movie.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of having this conversation, I mean, I remember there being the whole, in Bride of Frankenstein, when the monster goes to the hermit's house and, you know, like kind of breaks down crying and the blind man's kind of patting him. Like I remember my friend John Kitley just like losing his mind at some scholar who'd written, you know, that clearly the, you know, the monster is giving the blind hermit, you know, oral pleasure. And I'm like, ooh, okay. But then you go, I wouldn't put it past James Whale to be like, you know what this is going to look like.
Yeah.
It's not what it is, but it is what you think it is.
Yeah, and that's something I thought was so neat when they're talking about like the Hays Code era stuff, and then like what was it, the pansy craze, I think they called it.
Right.
Like that like really cheeky sort of like gay humor that got thrown into stuff
Right.
in a way that's like, I love the notion of it being like, that's not what's going on. Why do you think that's what's going on? You're so nasty. You're so bad. Like, I think that's so funny, and it's such a good way to like get an audience to tell on themselves. It's great.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's so slick to just throw that stuff in and then point the finger.
Yeah, especially all that stuff in like my favorite James Whale picture is the old dark house.
Oh
So
my
to
gosh.
see how much like love they tossed on that one, because most folks will hit you with like Bride of Frankenstein because it's awesome, but like that old dark house is so like they talked about in the doc, it like makes fun of the spooky house movie while also like creating the blueprint for what those spooky house movies look like.
Right.
And like the woman in drag playing Horace Femme or whatever his name is with like the patchy beard and everything. It's great. It's so good. It's like just an iconic, awesome movie.
I did like, I remember watching The Hunger at a movie viewing party, and I mean, we had a similar reaction, but it wasn't the same reaction as I was watching the hosts have, where they're just like, "Oh my God." I'm like, yeah, me too.
Yeah, I feel like I can't put that movie on in a group of friends because it's going to change the whole vibe of the evening really fast. Yeah, like everybody's going to start feeling a lot during that one. But I mean, you can't. Everyone in it's hot, and like it's that thing they talk about when they're bringing up like when they move past Nosferatu and they get into Dracula, about how like the vampire just became like this psychosexual like icon and image that has lasted like 100 years into the future at least.
Well, and I also liked, I mean, again, just from a historical standpoint, like learning more backstory about Mary Shelley and going, oh, I didn't know that. And that's a cool thing to kind of stir into the mix. Same thing with Bram Stoker. You're like, oh yeah, the idea that he went the other way as soon as Oscar Wilde gets arrested. You're like, uh-huh.
Yeah,
okay.
That was in those love letters that he wrote to I about called him Will Wheaton, but that's the guy from Star Trek.
Walt Whitman.
Walt Whitman, that one. Yeah. But when it's talking about those letters he wrote to him and how like that's some unrequited man love right there. Like that was palpable stuff. Yeah, wild. And if you've ever seen the show Drunk History on Comedy Central, like they have a whole segment about Mary Shelley. Went up to like a big house together and like smoked a bunch of opium and drank a lot and did what artists do. And then they decided to like have a competition to who can come up with the scariest story. And that's how she wrote Frankenstein, is just sitting around these dudes doing drugs and getting weird and like having a proverbial like pissing contest about who can make the weirdest thing happen.
No, yeah, it was like a big like weekend sex party. Like, let's just be honest.
Like that's how all great art is made.
And that is exactly what I was gonna say. Like, that's how you do it, right? If you're gonna do it right. Get stoned, get laid with everybody at the same time in some cases.
And let what happens happen.
And write the first science fiction horror book. Like, easy as pie, 1, 2, 3. So
man, to be a fly on that wall.
Ew. I mean, like, but so cool. Like,
yeah, I mean, that's a writing workshop for you right there.
Oh, hell yeah.
Well, and I think that kind of just circle back to what I was saying when we started off. Like, I think this is a valuable series for all people, of any divination. It's like, well, what do you like? What what's important is that you recognize that not everybody is the same as you, and yet we are all the same in that we enjoy this genre. I mean, my whole kind of mission with the Horror 101 book and Hidden Horror and now the Friday Night Frights is about hearing other people's voices. Like, I don't need to just tell my story. I'm actually kind of bored of my story. I want to hear other people's stories. I want to hear the movie that you saw. And like, that was what was really exciting. Like, especially watching, these classics that I've known for years and years and years, to be like, oh, wow, what if it's something else? And what if there's more going on underneath than I knew? And that's exciting to me. Like, that means I get to watch the movie again and experience it for the first time.
I was just going to ask if you had watched any of the films in the documentary since watching it, and has your, perspective or even perception changed on it?
Well, just watching the documentary and going, oh, wow, I never thought about that movie this way. And I never thought about that movie this way. There were things where I was kind of like, Norman Bates. I mean, like that whole thing of like, well, he has a sexual attraction to Marion Crane. So is he gay? Is he not? What's going on for him? I mean, I think Norman Bates is still like just a maelstrom of emotions and things, but I don't know that I was like sold on the fact that he was gay. I was like, okay, all right. I mean, I could see a point being made for that. I could also just see a point for somebody who feels just so repressed and has to lash out whenever he feels like he's being naughty. And I mean, that could be sex of any vein. Right.
I thought the biggest thing I had picked up, and it's stuff I didn't know until watching the documentary, but the thing I had picked up about specifically the Norman stuff is about, like, I don't think when they wrote it, I don't think they were thinking like Norman Bates is a gay man that dresses up as his mother and all that. But I think it's the same thing as Nightmare on Elm Street 2, where like Anthony Perkins's like lived experience in reality like can't help but inform that performance. And it like colors it, the whole thing, even if that's not in the narrative text what's going on, like as the film as like a moving painting, that like sort of translates, especially the stuff they're talking about with I can't remember the character or the actor, but the really butch guy that comes in and starts
John
like,
Gavin. Yeah.
Like the way they talk about that being a representation of like the masculine and the fey, like sort of going at each other for dominance inside Norman's body. I thought that was really cool and interesting. And not knowing that Anthony Perkins was like closeted for so long totally made that fly over my head when I first watched Psycho.
Well, and I thought that interview with Oz Perkins, his son, was just, oh man, just so lovely. And there are so many lovely moments of just real humanity. It's not, and that's what I also like. Yes, we have a few scholars in there, but mostly it's fans. It's just people who are like, I love this, and here's why I love it, and here's what I like about it. But that interview with Oz Perkins just kind of broke my heart a little bit, and then healed it right back up. It was beautiful.
Yeah, it's like a perfect documentary arc in one interview. Like it's really good stuff.
Yeah, that one was, I think, the most touching for me. It was really poignant to hear him talk about his father and about his father's experiences and how he never really got to come out. Right. Even for as long as he lived, even into a time where it may have been more acceptable. The truth was that, he had picked it up somewhere else. Yeah. That he had, gotten AIDS through a bad blood transfusion. I thought that was really like just so sad.
Yeah.
So, and I vaguely remember that happening. And I mean, I was obsessed with Tony Perkins. I'm still obsessed with Who Amongst Us, right? But like, ever since the first time I saw Psycho, that was the first movie I ever saw him in.
Mhm.
And yeah, it was just so like heartbreaking to know, reading that about him, like, you know, later on. It's like, God, he never was able, he never got that chance to come out and be his true self.
Yeah, for
So
sure. Well, we're gonna have to wrap this up. Unfortunately, this is again, this is Queer for Fear, the history of queer horror. It's streaming now on Shudder, and thank you both for coming on, chatting about the show. And again, this is Scare-A-Thon 2023, benefiting the Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project. The link to donate is below in the description. Please donate. This is a very important issue to myself and my guests. And thank you both again. Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.